Welcome classic rock fans to another episode of Classic Song Review, where classic tracks are excavated and explored. And for today I want to look at the wonderful Eleanor Rigby. What's interesting about this song is it's basically an ode to an unexamined life. We see a song where sort of loneliness and futility is presented as an inevitable aspect of the human condition. Musically, of course, it's interesting, as many argue that this song is kind of the beginnings of Baroque pop. In fact, Ray Davies went on record to say, if I may quote, it sounds just like Haydn, like they're trying to please music teachers in primary schools. But Ray Davies wasn't the only one who commented upon this track. Of course, Pete Townsend, who also noted that this song was a watershed moment, not only in music but for the Beatles. I certainly think that Eleanor Rigby and, in fact, the Revolver album is definitely a watershed moment for the Beatles. But Pete Townsend went on to say that it was a very important move forward. Also, that wonderful track by the Zombies off their Odyssey and Oracle album, A Rose for Emily, has got to have been inspired, I think, by Eleanor Rigby. Some critics have argued that Eleanor Rigby employs stock sort of comic figures like the elderly spinster or the lonely sort of parish priest. But there's certainly nothing comedic about its subject matter. As I said, it forces us to look at sort of loneliness and futility. And that, of course, coupled with its very funereal sort of music, it has it gives it a distinctly English affectation, a distinctly English-European sort of melancholic sensibility to it. And I'm certainly not the only one to think so. In fact, the musicologist Howard Goodall has said, if I may quote, "The Beatles' works are a stunning roll call of sublime melodies that perhaps only Mozart could match. In European musical history, Eleanor Rigby is an urban version of a tragic ballad." Indeed, it's a song that certainly kept the beard strokers busy for years. There are certainly some interesting stories surrounding the composition of this track. For example, George Harrison suggests the refrain, "Look at all the lonely people," which is a leitmotif, a motif that's repeated throughout the song, of course. John Lennon says he tweaked it here and there, but John Lennon's biographer, Peter Shotton, said his contribution was virtually nil to this track. Ringo was supposed to have suggested Father Mackenzie's evening preoccupation, that is, darning his socks, which was quite interesting. Of course, the song, the name Father Mackenzie, Paul originally liked Father McCartney because it fitted in beautifully with the song and had an air of realism to it. Although he later dismisses the use of the name McCartney because it would give it an autobiographical flavour, which he certainly did not want. Also, the character of Father Mackenzie was very, very different from his own father. Apparently, the name Father Mackenzie was arrived at just by sticking his finger in a phone book. Interestingly, of course, it was Pete Shotton that suggested that the characters should be brought together in death, not in any kind of meaningful way, just that the priest officiates over Eleanor Rigby's funeral. That comes from Pete Shotton's book, John Lennon in My Life, published in 1983. Of course, the central protagonist wasn't always going to be Eleanor Rigby. The name that was originally held for her was Miss Daisy Hawkins. Now, McCartney rejects this name because he feels it lacks realism. It sounds too contrived. But the name, how he comes up on the name Eleanor Rigby is quite interesting. Apparently he liked the name Eleanor, who was the name of Eleanor Bron, who was an actress that starred in the film Help with the Beatles, of course. But Rigby, of course, he went to Bristol, down to the West Country, to visit his then-girlfriend Jane Asher, who was in a play called The Happiest Days of Your Life. And it was there that he spotted a specific shop, and the shop's name was Rigby and Evans Limited, Wine and Spirit Shippers. And obviously that's where he got the name Rigby, allegedly. Of course, no one questioned McCartney's story in terms of the origins of the name Eleanor Rigby. I mean, why should they? But it wasn't until the 1980s that somebody spotted a headstone in St Peter's Churchyard, Wootton, which is an area in Liverpool, that bore the name Eleanor Rigby. And what's interesting is this churchyard is where a young McCartney met Lennon. So people are often suggesting that this name perhaps informed McCartney on an unconscious level. But some interesting information about the young lady buried in St Peter's Churchyard. Obviously her name is Eleanor Rigby. She was born in 1895, dies in 1939, aged 44. She was married to, if I may refer to my notes, married Thomas Woods and died in 1939, as I've just said. Interestingly, there was a document actually bearing the signature of Eleanor Rigby that went up for auction. I think it sold for like 115,000 or something silly like that. But for me, the most interesting story surrounding the song is the story that Donovan tells about its composition. he says that McCartney turned up on his door with an embryonic version of the tune, and it went something like Ola Natungi blowing his mind in the dark with a pipe full of clay. No one can say. Of course, you could argue that version still sort of has that kind of motif of loneliness to it, but it also has a very stoner feel to it as well. I love the ending of the song where the characters are kind of united at a funeral, but they're not united. They're not even afforded that luxury. They just happen to coincidentally sort of cross paths, so to speak. But it's interesting, the poet Allen Ginsberg has said that the line, "Or look at all the lonely people," was the Beatles referencing their own audience. A statement that I refute. I don't agree with that at all. Certainly McCartney recalls being taken to visit lots of elderly people when he was younger. And if that's true, if that is in any way impacted upon the writing of this song, that gives it an air of sort of social responsibility. There's an element of finger wagging to it, if you like. But certainly it's a song that points to the dangers of loneliness and isolation. In terms of the composition of the song was actually composed on the piano. It was George Martin that brought in the string octet, if you like, for the arrangements on this song. And when he recorded them, he put the microphone very close to the strings to give the song a harsher feel to it. According to Jane Asher, the song's orchestrations reflect McCartney's love of Vivaldi at the time. George Martin, I think it's more sort of George Martin, to be honest. In fact, in George Martin's biography published in 1979, the biography was called All You Need Is Ears, the personal story of a genius who created the Beatles. He muses on his love of Bernard Herrmann. Bernard Herrmann, of course, creates the score for Psycho, which George Martin greatly admired, which is why the strings on this track have a very staccato, choppy feel to it, which adds tension and drama to the music. So anyway, let's just think about the lyrics in a little bit more detail. If I may refer to my notes, All the Lonely People gives it a very sort of panoramic feel before the song then sort of focuses on two representatives, two characters who lead very lonely lives, of course. I like the line, "Picking up the rice is someone on the periphery of other people's lives and other people's happiness. She lives in a dream." She's seen as kind of a foolish spinster who desperately tries to preserve her looks by applying this cream and waiting in the window to be noticed. And then we get that wonderful rhetorical question, but who is it for? And of course the point of rhetorical questions is they're supposed to make us think. They're not supposed to require an answer, but they are supposed to provoke an intellectual response to get us to think about something. Eleanor Rigby, of course, leads a life that speaks of desperation, whereas Father Mackenzie leads a life that just speaks of futility, writing a sermon that no one will hear. I mean, the whole point of a sermon is it's supposed to be delivered to an audience. Then ultimately the conclusion of the song is she's buried along with her name. No one came. I mean, crikey, it's a stark image, isn't it? But what I really like is the image of Father Mackenzie wipes the soil from his hands in this very dismissive gesture. And then we get that wonderful refrain, "No one was saved." I love that line. It gives it almost a sort of quasi-religious context. Anyway, it's without a doubt an absolutely remarkable song, especially for its time. You've been watching the episode of Classic Song Review.